Well, taxi operators affected by the pandemic are getting much needed help. A fund of over R1 billion has been set up to help minibus taxis, cabs and e-hailing drivers. Over 200,000 operators will receive a once-off relief to the value of some R5,000. But the Transport Minister, Fikile Mbalula, says to qualify, you have to be registered with the taxman. And that makes sense to me. Well, let's get reaction to the fund from the South African National Taxi Council's Philip Taaibosch, who joins me now for that conversation. Mr. Taaibosch, I know that you are itching to get to the point about whether or not taxi owners and operators are registered for tax. I'll say to you, let's hold off for a moment. Let's start with first things first. Your reaction to this fund for someone who is outside of the taxi industry, e-hailing and cab industry. We will be saying, you know, what can a person do with R5,000? But you know better. You are in touch with your own members who have been affected. Will this help in any way?
Tula Suze, good afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. We cannot be happy, but we can feel relieved that at least something has been done for the suffering taxi operators has underwent. And I can only say that we take it as it comes, that it is a relief, it's not a compensation or payment. And when we are talking about the relief and coming from somebody which you could not negotiate yourself, you have to accept whatever is coming on the table because it's a relief.
Yeah. Of course, Mr. Taaibosch, someone will say that perhaps the cab drivers and e-hailing drivers, you know, the case can be made that they got into real difficulties, especially in the early days of the pandemic and the lockdown, and were not able to repay some of their installments for their vehicles. Someone could come back and say that, you know, in as far as minibus taxi industry, you were only affected for possibly about 3 weeks or thereabouts in the early initial hard lockdown. But since then, you've really been operating at full capacity in many instances.
Tula Caesar, I wish that could be demonstrated that in actual fact that's what the taxi industry suffered. The taxi industry suffered immensely through this lockdown and the suspensions of operations. The taxi industry, and hence we had to go and knock on the doors of the banks. And I want to appreciate what the banks and different financiers did for taxi operators by giving them what you could say it was a relief sort of payment on their vehicles, so that we know that many taxi operators have lost their taxis because they could not afford the payment. If it was 3 weeks, I would not be crying. But because the pandemic has been very long and we've been operating on different conditions, and hence we could not have passengers in our vehicles, and hence I want to indicate that it is not true that the e-hailers have suffered. I want to talk about the entire taxi industry, and when I'm talking about the taxi industry, I'm talking about those who are licensed to transport passengers in the country, meter taxis, cross-border long distance, and even local taxi operators. I'm talking about those operators.
Right, Mr. Taaibosch, before I run out of time, let me get to the hot button issue that you want to address. Part of what was said by the minister is that, you know, to qualify for this kind of relief, financial relief, you need to be registered, particularly for tax purposes. My understanding is that you believe this is a moot point because you argue, and I can tell you now, Mr. Taaibosch, that the lines were buzzing in as far as talk radio is concerned yesterday afternoon. Many people arguing that the taxi industry is first in line to receive this kind of relief, but they don't even pay tax. They don't even contribute to the South African fiscus. That's the issue that you want to address. So you believe it's a moot point? There's no need to even say this.
I think it's like the democratic dispensation which we entered into in 1994, that is a continuous explanatory process. And I believe that we will continue explaining this to the public of South Africa, so that the myth that is going on of saying taxi industry is not paying tax. And I want to say that if for whatever reason you would want to clarify, you can go to SARS. There is no legal taxi operator in this country who has not received a tax clearance from SARS. And tax clearance means that SARS is aware of your presence, and SARS is aware that you are making business. And the taxi industry is like any other business that is operated by an individual. And it is between that individual and SARS to be able to say that you are compliant or you are not compliant. I think this myth of saying taxi people are not paying or are not recognized by SARS, it's a myth. No taxi operator in this country, Taaibosch, can obtain an operating license from without a tax clearance. And where do you get the tax clearance? You get the tax clearance from the receiver himself, from SARS. That's the only body who can actually give you a tax clearance certificate. All the taxi operators in the country have tax clearance certificates, and if there are any other things that needs to happen, that needs to be dealt with by the individual and SARS. But at this present moment, we, I think about 2 months ago, we met with SARS to discuss how we are going to ensure that education is received by taxi people, and that whatever miscommunication which has happened or misinformation that has happened will be cleared by Santaco and SARS. And we are sitting in a meeting, we are waiting for a meeting, we agreed on a date, and we're just waiting for SARS to come forward and say, how do we take this vehicle forward? But there is no truth in the fact that people are saying that taxi operators are not paying tax. They are like any other business person or any other inhabitant of South Africa.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time. Philip Taaibosch from the South African National Taxi Council, weighing in there on the relief fund that has been announced by the Department of Transport for the taxi industry, the entirety of the industry, not just minibus taxis. And hey, Edward Kiswetter, Mr. Taaibosch is waiting for your call. Give him a call. Let's see if we can, get more education around tax matters for that industry, as he says in that interview.